Welcome one and all back to Word Alive on Romans 8:28 Publishing. We are back on once again, and we're getting ready to start with a new series. This series is, I think, going to be a very good one, and one that I think will be useful to anyone who's walking that Christian walk. Because what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about the recipe for a legendary victory. And that's something that we all ought to seek after, because it's those legendary victories that provide that testimony, that provide that illustration, provide that light for those that don't know Jesus yet. And that ought to be our goal, that we get these victories, not for our glory, but for God's glory. But it helps always, as I say, to know, first of all, why we need the legendary victory. We know we need it to build the kingdom, but also how, right? A lot of times we talk to you about do this, do that, why to do this, but we don't ever tell you how to do it. So what we're going to be doing over the next couple of lessons, we're going to be looking at how to be prepared for the legendary victory, how to make sure that when you end up in the situation, you get the legendary victory. And that's why we're calling it the recipe for a legendary victory. We're going to give you the ingredients and how they come together to create the legendary victory. And we're going to be coming from a very popular text, one that anybody who's studied the Bible probably knows this text. Anybody who's been in church for any length of time, and heck, even if your mom just dragged you to Sunday school when you were a little kid, you probably know this story. That's right, we're going to be coming from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, that famous story of David and Goliath. That's right, that Bible favorite, David and the Goliath, the little man who goes up against the giant, and even a phrase and a terminology that's used in many different areas and avenues outside of the church, David and Goliath. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And really, it's interesting, I've read this story numerous times over the years, and this is a rich story. A lot of things that I've never heard spoken about that I found in this story, and really, you could probably teach on David and Goliath for a couple of months if you really wanted to. In fact, this aspect of it, that recipe for the legendary victory, is probably going to take me about 6 lessons just to get through this recipe. And I'm going to tell you right up front, because I always believe what I always do is whenever I teach, I like to hit the main point, the biggest point at the beginning while everybody's focused, while everybody's still alert, right? And that way they make sure you get that main point, and then I hit it again at the end. That way that's kind of the last thing you hear is the last thing you take with you. So I want to start off with, here's the main point that if this is all you get out of this, is the most important thing, is to understand that 90% of that legendary victory, that 90% of what it goes into that legendary victory actually occurs before you even get on to the battlefield. A lot of times we think that legendary victory happens just on that day of the contest, but really the legendary victory, there's years and decades even at times that go into the legendary victory. So it's what you do today that's going to determine the outcome when you get on that battlefield. It's going to be the impetus for that legendary victory. What you do today that might not happen for 10 years from now. The things that you do today are going to prepare you to fight that enemy that you haven't even seen yet. So I want you to understand and take with you, if nothing else, take this, that 90% of your legendary victory comes before you even step onto the battlefield. And today, in this story of David and Goliath, we're going to be looking at really just setting the scene. And this is one of the things, setting the scene. So we're just going to look at who are the primary players in this, where is this taking place at. And a lot of times, I just want to encourage you in this, when you're reading your Bible, and sometimes when we read about just the setup, the kind of setting the scene, we kind of skim through that because we want to get to the meat of the story. But read every word when you're reading the scriptures, because God does not waste a word. And even when He's just talking about where this is happening and who's going to be in it, He's already giving us lessons that we can apply to our own lives and our own situations. So we're going to start at the very beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 17. And starting at verse 1, it begins like this. We're just, again, looking at the major players and where this is taking place at. And really the subject of our lesson for tonight is going to be that the first ingredient in a legendary victory, and we don't often want to hear it, but the first ingredient in a legendary victory is a formidable opponent and serious consequences. Because think about it, I wrestled in high school, and when I was wrestling my senior year, if I came up against a freshman and it was his first match and I beat him, even if I pinned him in 30 seconds, that's not a legendary victory because the opponent wasn't up to my level of experience. He didn't have as much experience, he didn't have as much training, he didn't have the same conditioning as me. So the fact that I pinned him in 30 seconds really means nothing, right? So we have to have a formidable opponent to have a legendary victory. The other thing is we need some serious consequences. Think about, like, if I'm the last match and our team's already up by 36 points in the match, right? It doesn't matter if I win or lose, right? So if I win, even if I, again, pin the guy in 30 seconds, it's not going to be a legendary victory because what happens? The match was already decided. The outcome was already determined. But what if we're down by 1 point and there's 20 seconds left in the match and I'm losing by a point? And if I lose, we've lost the match. But, I get a takedown, get 2 points in the last 20 seconds of the match, and now all of a sudden we go from being on the brink of defeat to now we're elevated, now we're victorious now. Maybe we won districts, maybe we won, right? And that's when you get the legendary victory. When it's the enemy that you don't want to face, the enemy that looks too tough, and when it's the consequences that you might not want to face if you lose, that's where the legendary victory comes from. So don't run from these things, because if God brought you onto that battlefield, He will make sure that you emerge victorious. So we're looking here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it starts out like this. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Damim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and drew camp up in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them." Right? So if you can imagine, say, if you're not aware, the Philistines and the Israelites for just forever have been at odds. They've been aware ever since the Israelites came into the promised land. They were fighting the Philistines, right? It was constant tug of war and back and forth. Even if you look at the book of Judges that comes before 1 Samuel, we see that the Philistines would come in, they take over the land. The Jews would, the Israelites, they would pray to God, they would call out to God, and He would send a judge to deliver them, and they'd be victorious. And there was this cycle, just always them and the Philistines. So it's that recurring enemy that keeps on coming back that we got to just take out once and for all. And we see that they're camped. One's on one mountaintop, the other's on another mountaintop. But where does the battle take place? The battle takes place in the valley. So sometimes where you don't want to go into the valley, you want to stay on the mountaintop all the time. But the legendary victory takes place in the valley very, very often. And this wasn't, when you think about war, I just want to kind of set the scene for this too. It's not like we think of war where you're launching missiles at each other from 100 miles away, right? Or where one adversary needs to hide in the town among the people because they're just technologically can't hang on the battlefield. And this was men coming out with swords, coming out with spears, and it was hand-to-hand combat, and it was which unit worked the best together, and which warriors were the strongest, which warriors had the best technique and the best training. That's what determined the outcome of the battles back in the day. There was an actual battlefield. You didn't fight in the streets. You went out onto the field, into the valley, and you fought there, warrior on warrior, strength on strength, unit on unit. And so this is where this is taking place. And then here you go, as they're lining up and they're getting ready to come down into the valley. There's one man among the Philistines who decides he's going to step up and he's going to take one for the team. He says, "I'm going to be the one that's going to determine this." And this man, I'm going to tell you, this man, Goliath, who's about to step forward, he's the one that represents our opponent into the legendary victory. So let's look at to have a legendary victory, let's look at what our opponent is going to look like. And it begins like this: "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp." So here we are, we have one letter, A, and then the next word tells us just what we're up against to get the legendary victory. a champion named Goliath. Now, I want to make sure we understand, because we think of champion in a certain way in our time, but this is something altogether different. Goliath was a champion in war. Goliath was a champion in destruction and death and mayhem. Goliath was a champion in kill or be killed. He had slain many without being slain. We think of a champion, a golf champion. He plays 10 tournaments in a year. He wins 1 out of the 10, and we call him a champion. You've got a football team that can win just barely more than half its game, make the playoffs, win a couple more games, and they call them a champion. Even in boxing, you can have a guy that loses a dozen fights on the way to becoming a champion in a weight class that might have 3 or 4 other champions. No, when we're talking about a champion, we're talking about a champion who had to defy death in order to be a champion. And he's been long and hard at this. He is feared by his enemies, and he is respected by his allies. That's what we're looking at in Goliath. Now let's take a look at the physical stature of Goliath. It says his height was 6 cubits in a span. 6 cubits, just to give you an idea what 6 cubits in a span is 9 feet, 9 inches tall. Now if you're trying to picture what 9 feet, 9 inches tall looks like, I'm about 5'10". Shaquille O'Neal is 7'2", so that makes him about 16 inches taller than I am. About, just say for round numbers, let's call it 1.5 feet even taller than I am. So if Shaquille O'Neal is 7'2" and Goliath is 9'9", Goliath is more than 2 feet taller, 2.5 feet taller than Shaquille O'Neal. So if you can picture me standing next to Shaquille O'Neal, that's what Shaquille O'Neal would look like standing next to Goliath. We would look like little children next to Goliath. We would look like 3-4-year-olds next to Goliath. That's what we're talking about in walking out there and looking up at that enemy. That's what we would be looking at. And he wasn't just big, right? I think about Andre the Giant. If I think about back wrestling in the day, professionally, there was Andre the Giant, and he was huge. He was massive, but he was slow and he was cumbersome, and he didn't have any kind of agility at all. But let's take a look at Goliath. It says he had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. So let's think about this. When we talk about this, we talk about the 5,000 shekels is about 125 pounds. So then with the bronze greaves that were on his legs, with the helmet on his head, with the javelin on his back, he's probably carrying around about 150 pounds on him. David probably didn't weigh a whole lot more than 150 pounds. So Goliath was not just big, he was also strong. But remember what I said about what battle was like back then? It wasn't shooting guns at each other, it wasn't launching missiles at each other, it was hand-to-hand combat. So not only did he have to be strong, but with all this weight on him, with basically the same amount of weight that David weighed on his back, he was able to deflect blows while also striking blows. He was able to run, he was able to jump, he was able to dodge, he was able to duck, even with all this armor. But in order to be able to survive, he had to be agile while wearing all this. So we have not just a mammoth, huge man, but we've got a man who's incredibly strong to be able to march and do all these things with this on, plus to be nimble enough and agile enough that he can still defend himself while at the same time attacking others. This is a legendary opponent that leads to a legendary victory. And then it says his spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So again, this goes to his strength and his agility. We think of a spear as something you would just throw at somebody, right? But he has a spear that's 12 feet long, weighs about 35 pounds. And again, he is strong enough and agile enough that he can swing that spear 12 feet long, 33 pounds. He can swing that thing like a sword. He can use it to deflect a blow like he's carrying a 4-foot long, 10-pound sword, and he's swinging the spear around like that. So we see here, when we talk about that legendary victory, we talked about already two things that are needed. We already looked at one. We need to have a legendary opponent. We need a formidable opponent. We need an opponent that we are going to be uncomfortable or downright scared to go out and fight. Now, what was the other thing we said we need? We said that in order to have that legendary victory, we also have to have some serious consequences. So we're going to look at that aspect of this next. It says, beginning in verse 8, it says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul?" And that's just, I love that line, because that is just the way that our enemies will talk to us. Aren't you? They will identify you by your flaws. Right? We're Philistines, and how does he address that? You're servants. You're servants of Saul. So that's the same way our enemies. You're not. You're a servant. You're a servant of your drinking habit. You're a servant of your low self-esteem. You're a servant of your relationships. You're a servant of your lack of income. You're a servant of your health issue. That's what they try to plant in your head when they come. But you are so much more than that, because you are a child of God, and He does not see you the same way that enemy sees you. He sees things. He wouldn't have brought that enemy before you if you could not defeat that enemy. So don't let that enemy identify you by your issue, but you identify yourself the way that God sees you, so that you can have that legendary victory. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about some serious consequences to have a legendary victory. And so this Philistine goes on to say, "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him, you will serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So we think about this. So we look at what are the consequences of this battle. They are serious. They are severe. Whoever wins or loses this battle, you've got a whole country that is now subject to another country. You've got a country, an entire country of people that are giving up their rights, that are giving up their entitlements to, and being subject to another, all based on what? All based on the outcome of one man's battle. That is serious consequences. That's enough serious consequences that you might want to run from the battlefield. But again, if God brought you to the battlefield, trust and believe this, you will emerge victorious. Maybe not unscathed, but you will emerge victorious from the battlefield. And we're gonna see that as we continue on through this lesson. The consequences are severe, but look at the glory if you win. So when you see it, don't get so hung up on what's the negative consequence if I lose, but with God's promise that you will be victorious, focus on, man, what's it going to look like when I win? And so we go on, right? So now we've identified, right? We've identified, that's right. In order to have a legendary victory, we've got to have a formidable opponent, okay? I accept it. And then we know we've got to have some serious consequences. We gave it to you from the scriptures. So now we're going to look at us in this scenario, right? We've got our enemy we've already looked at. Now let's look at what we look like when we step into the legendary battle. That's right. We're going to look at how David is described in these scriptures and in these words. And we're picking up here now at verse 12. And it says, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest." Okay? So the 3 oldest are in the army. The 3 oldest are the ones that are trained for the battle. They're the ones that have received the training. They're the ones that had the experience in battle. And David was the youngest. Now, what has David been doing while his big brothers have been off training and fighting in wars? It says, "But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep." So here's us, right? Here's David. So we've already looked at Goliath. David had two jobs. You know what David's two jobs were? He wasn't in the army. His two jobs were tending sheep and playing the harp for Saul. So if you can imagine this, right? Imagine if this was a heavyweight fight, right? And the ring announcer comes into the ring. And he's going to say, in this corner, standing 9 feet, 9 inches tall, 600 pounds, 100 in battle, 100 wins, 0 defeats. He's strong as a bull and nimble as a gazelle. Goliath! And in this corner, standing 5 feet, 10 inches tall, 165 pounds, he's a shepherd. And he plays the harp. David, are you sure you want you against that guy? That guy against... Now, you know it's not too late, man. You can duck out the back. I won't say anything because you got no... You sure about this, David? All right. David! That's right. That's probably about the way that announcement would go at the beginning of the fight. But what he doesn't know, what that ring announcer doesn't know, is that the referee is in David's corner. The judges are in David's corner. The cut man is in David's corner. All the trainers are in David's corner. And the fight is rigged. There isn't a chance. But what he doesn't know is, because God's on David's side, it's Goliath that doesn't have a chance, regardless of what it might look like from the outside. So we look at this now, and here's the thing. I'm not saying that we're very often going to look forward to facing the giant. I can't remember a day when I woke up and I said, you know, God, can you send a Goliath my way? You know, how about, can you send me maybe a major health problem that I've got to deal with? Or could you put my children in a situation that I don't see a way out of? You know, what can you do? How about, can you take my job today, God? How about that? Can you do that? No, so I'm not saying that you ought to be looking forward to that giant. I'm not saying that you're even going to be excited when you see that giant. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I've had some giants I faced, and I've been excited because there are areas where my faith was strong. And I said, you know what? I know I'm going to win this one. I know this is going to be lit, but every once in a while, I'll get that giant where my faith maybe isn't as strong. And I'm like, God, you sure you want me to do this? Are you sure you want me to walk out on that battlefield? Are you sure you want me to call this guy out and choose this battle now? So I'm not telling you ought to seek it out. I'm not telling you, hey, go out. And I'm not telling you, now, I don't want you to get this wrong. I don't want you to get out here and say, well, Mike said that I have to have a legendary opponent in order to have a legendary victory. I need to have a formidable opponent. So I'm going to take up smoking so I can show God healed me of cancer. I'm going to go and quit my job with no plan because that way I can show that God can provide. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not even saying you should look forward to it. So you maybe say, well, then what do you tell? Why are you taking our time to do this? Why are you taking your time to go through all this if this isn't something that I can even control? Because this is what I want to do, is I want to make sure that you understand all the promises of God. I want to make sure that you understand them completely. As we look at the promise of God, sometimes we only look at part of it, right? No weapon formed against us shall prosper. We love to focus on won't prosper, but what we don't often look at is the weapon will form. That's something that it will come up against you, but it's just not going to prosper. We can look at a lot of different things. We look at, the scriptures say that God will complete what He had begun in you until the coming of Jesus, right? So if He's got to complete it, that means it's not going to be a cakewalk through it. That's mean there's going to be a process to the completion, and parts of that process we're not going to like. So I'm letting you know, the reason I'm telling you this is because you are a child of God, and so you are going to face these legendary, these formidable opponents, and you are going to face these serious consequences. I think about what Jesus said in John chapter 16, verse 33, where He said, and we love to quote, For I have overcome the world. For Jesus has overcome the world. But what He starts that scripture with is, you will have trouble. In this world, you will have trouble. So before fear not, for I have overcome the world comes, in this world you will have trouble. So the reason I'm going through this part of this lesson is to understand, as a child of God, You have legendary victories in you. You have legendary victories that are going to come along in your life. And I just want to encourage you in this, when that formidable opponent comes, when those serious consequences are facing you, don't panic, don't fear, don't run, but do the things that we talk about in the lessons after this to be now so that you are prepared when that formidable opponent comes. And it may seem contrary to say, you know what, I ought to look forward to, or I ought to walk into a legendary or a formidable opponent, right? But let me do this for you. If you don't think that a legendary opponent or a formidable opponent is necessary for the legendary victory, I'm going to talk to you about a boxer. All right, and I'm going to tell you he had 37 wins, and I'm going to name just a few of the people that he defeated. And you unless you are an avid boxing fan, you're not going to know who I'm talking about. He defeated Warren Williams, Quinn Navarre, Louis Monaco, Brian Scott, Dickie Ryan, and Rocky Papelli are probably, other than the next one I'm about to name, are probably his most prominent victories. And when I give you those opponents, you probably have no idea who this legendary boxer is. But if I was to say to you, he was the first man to defeat Iron Mike Tyson, even people who don't follow boxing will probably immediately say, oh, that's James Buster Douglas. Why? Because it wasn't all those little defeats, all those little victories that he had that made him the legend. It was the formidable opponent, Iron Mike, the one that people often lost the fight even before they stepped into the ring because they were so afraid of him. That's what led to the legendary victory. Because I tell you this, a cure, getting the common cold and it getting cured is an act of God. To think about, your body is fighting off things that you can't even see. There are microscopic organisms in your body and your body fights off. That's an act of God, but it's not a legendary victory because that's not a formidable opponent. But when your prayer and when your faith and when your service and when your devotion to God brings you out of cancer, that's what creates the legendary victory. That's what creates the victory that's going to save your children, that's going to save your neighbors, that's going to get your coworkers curious about what it is it about this Jesus that they're worshiping, that they can walk through these things with peace, that they can come out the other side better than they went in. Paying, even if you have an unexpected bill that comes up, you work your couple hours of overtime and you pay that $50 bill. That's an act of God because He provided the job for you to do it. He provided you the opportunity to work. He provided you the strength to work. So that's an act of God, but that's not a legendary victory. But man, if you've got a $41,000 debt and your prayer brings along a solution to that debt, yeah, that's a legendary victory. That's the thing that's going to draw people to you. That's the victory that's going to make you salt and light. That's the one that's going to grow the kingdom. That's the legendary victory, right? So again, I just want to encourage you in this. If you're facing something right now, and if you're not facing something right now that looks too big for you, you're going to one day. I'm going to give you one piece of advice and then I'm going to close this up. It's something that I think has become a mantra for my life, and many of you have probably heard me say it before, but I'm going to say it every time I can. When you face the giant that looks too big for you, that enemy that looks like you got no shot at defeating it, don't focus on that giant. Don't focus on that issue. Focus on all the things that God has already done for you. Focus on all the giants that you thought you couldn't beat, and yet here you are, you made it through to today. So don't focus on the giant in front of you. Focus on all the giants that God has already defeated on your behalf. But before I close up today, I just want to again remind you, I want to dispel this myth that victory is based on the day of the battle. The victory is not based on the day of the battle. The victory is based 90% on what you're doing today. You may not see the battle for weeks, for months, for years, but 90% of its outcome depends on what you did today. Think about So what I want you to do is now, this is what we like to talk about, is getting in your word. How do you prepare? You get in your word, you study, you pray, you make sure you got God on the line all the time so that when the enemy comes, you've already got God there with you on the line, ready to walk you through it. Start serving in your church, start serving in your community and building up those spiritual muscles, developing those spiritual skills that you need for the day of the battle. It's what you do today that's going to determine the legendary victory for the enemy that hasn't even presented himself yet. I mean, think about, we watch a Super Bowl game and we think it was all about the plays that were called that day, and we think it's all about how they played that day. But think about the players that are playing in the Super Bowl. They've probably been playing football since they were about 5, 6, 7 years old. They've gone through hundreds of hours of practice. They've gone through thousands of hours of training, of running, of lifting, of working on technique, on how they're gonna run a route, working on technique, how they're gonna block somebody, working on different moves to get past that left tackle, right, to get to the quarterback. So this is the thing that we've got to understand. It's what we do today that leads to that legendary victory, no matter how far off in the future it is. So I just want to encourage you, and we're going to be looking at some things now. We've looked at what we're about to face. The next few lessons, we're going to look at how we prepare ourselves now to face them when they come along. So next we're going to be looking at what do we do while we're in that time waiting for the opponent to come along. How do we be prepared for when they come along? And then we're going to close out looking at when we're on the battlefield. How do we implement what we've trained, what we've learned, what we've done as we've been waiting for this legendary opponent, this formidable opponent, this scary opponent, this giant 9'2", 9'9", 600-pound, strong as an ox opponent that we're about to face. That's what we're going to be looking at. So I want to encourage you to continue to tune in so that we can continue to teach you and prepare you for that big, formidable opponent that's going to lead to the legendary victory. God bless you, and I pray you all have a blessed day.